Chapter 6 of Confessions of a Failed Southern Lady by Florence King, published 1985. My first adult book was Gone with the Wind, which I read when I was 8. My favorite character was Ashley because he reminded me of Herb. I saw Melanie through a bedpan darkly, and Scarlett disappointed me when I came to the sentence, "She had not willingly opened a book since leaving the Fayetteville Female Academy the year before." Thanks to Granny's Fallen Woman songs, my favorite female character was Belle Watling. A book that proved to be a great comfort to me was plugged inadvertently during Traffic Safety Week assembly when Washington's chief of police came to our school to give us a lecture on how to cross the street. "The red light means stop," he boomed congenially, tapping his chart smartly with his pointer. "The green light means go, and the amber—" The audience dissolved in hysteria. Girls shrieked, boys yelled hubba hubba, and the teachers blushed furiously as they ran up and down the aisles trying to quiet us down. Herb was probably the only person in America who bought a copy of Forever Amber for its descriptions of Restoration London. Amber was an illegitimate daughter of the nobility who was farmed out to rustics and raised among people who sensed something different about her. The adults disliked her, the village girls envied her, the boys were afraid of her, and everybody called her stuck-up. She had peer problems long before she met Lord Carleton, so I identified with her at once. I did not understand the sex scenes, so I asked Peg for clarification. As the youngest in a large family, she was in a position to receive a wealth of trickle-down information not available to an only child. We had the "intercourse is when" conversation that passed for dirty talk in 1944. Her description of the beast with two backs puzzled me. "Where does the lady put her feet? In the air?" There was no air in Anthony Adverse. Compared to Hervey Allen's water symbolism, Granny's sexual euphemisms were models of clarity. Anthony copulated in oceans, whirlpools, waterfalls, and once I was certain in a giant copper vat. I could not understand what kept him from drowning, or given the logistics of the missionary position as described by Peg, why the lady didn't drown first. "Get your nose out of that book," Granny cried. "That's the biggest book I ever saw. I don't know how you can pick it up, much less read it. I have told you and told you that a lady is accomplished but never bookish." "Be that as it may," I replied. Granny wasn't the only person nagging on this subject now. The moment the war ended, GIs came home singing the praises of the European woman's perfect femininity. "Bullshit, they said that the last time," Mama snorted. She seemed to be the only person in the entire country willing to stand up for the home team. Newspapers and magazines picked up the scent and inundated the reading public with articles on "What's wrong with the American woman?" "This fellow Henry Adams answered that at the turn of the century," said Herb. Opening The Dynamo and the Virgin, he read aloud, "An American virgin would never dare command. An American Venus would never dare exist." "What the hell does that mean?" asked Mama. "America is a Protestant country and a puritanical country. There's no female ideal in America, never has been. Therefore, it's culturally impossible for the American woman to be feminine because she has no defining goddesses." "What about all those Catholic foreigners we've let in?" Granny demanded. "Seems to me they're trying to marry us to death." Herb shook his head. "Their chief ambition has been to Americanize themselves, and to that end," he added ruefully, "they've weakened their goddess heritage. The American Catholic doesn't see the Virgin as the figure of commanding womanliness that the medieval world worshipped. She's been turned into a long-suffering Irish mother. American women who copy that kind of femininity will end up as martyrs. Granny looked discomfited. I wondered if she was thinking about her missions of mercy. Though she would never consciously pattern herself on a Catholic figure, she had opted for goodness instead of badness. The soldiers in that article were talking about Dutch women, I countered. Holland is a Protestant country. Yeah, Mama agreed. How come they're such goody-goodies? European countries that are Protestant now were Catholic for many centuries, and pagan before that. The Protestant women of Europe have race memory on their side, Herb replied. What's race memory? I asked. An instinct that remains in people from something their ancestors did. Race memory runs in our family, Granny said with a pleased smile. Mama squared her shoulders and lifted her head. We don't need any goddamn goddesses from over there. They called Jean Harlow the American Venus, and now they're saying the same thing about Jane Russell. Americans can invent anything, she said proudly. Ah, you've hit on the key to all this, Louise, Herb said eagerly. American women do have to invent their own female ideals. That's why there are so many counterfeit versions of femininity, like the Southern Belle. This is the silliest conversation I ever did hear, Granny huffed. American womanhood is as constant as the tides. That Henry Adams is just some old foreigner who doesn't understand our ways. For once, Herb's poker face deserted him. Mrs. Redding, he was the great-grandson of President John Adams and the grandson of President John Quincy Adams. Be that as it may. The articles got worse when the Japanese occupation began. Writers poured invective on American women for not washing men's backs. A few desperate women took up backwashing. Why I washed my husband's back appeared, but the practice did not catch on. Another one did. Rosie the Riveter succumbed to journalistic bullying, quit her job, and scurried back to her home. Pleased by her obedience, the magazines called off their dogs and began praising American women for their good sense. The feminine mystique had begun. Characteristically, Mama picked this time to drop her bomb. I'm going back to work. Oh, Louise, Granny cried, you're a married woman with a child. The child is 10 going on 40, and I'm going back to work. I wish Mr. King would keep his theories to himself, Granny replied. He's put ideas in your head, and he's going to put them in that child's head. You wait and see, she added ominously. It doesn't have anything to do with that John Quincy shit-ass stuff, Mama said quickly. It's because I don't have a goddamn thing to do around here. You do the cooking, Jency does the cleaning. All I do is go to the friggin' grocery store. I'll be as crazy as Evelyn if I don't get out of this apartment. She would not be dissuaded. Granny gave in, but before turning Mama loose, she delivered a lecture on the proper way to appraise a husband of such unwarranted intentions. Mr. King is very sensitive. You must make him think that your getting a job is his idea. They rehearsed, with Granny playing Herb's part until she felt Mama had it all down pat. The performance opened at the dinner table after Granny had served the coffee. Her motto was, feed him first. She gave the cue, and it began. A full nest knows no rest till fledglings take to wing, Mama recited rudely. Herb's spoon stopped in mid-stir. Time hangs heavy on empty hands. Days grow long when cares grow short. It was vintage Granny, but Herb was too agape to be concerned with sources. He must have thought she wanted to have another baby. After waiting through a trenchant pause, which I'm certain she was counting, Mama gave him a look of such determined submissiveness that he flinched. I was thinking of going back to work, she murmured with unprecedented equivocation. Do you mind? He recommenced his stirring. It's up to you, Louise. Okay, that's what I wanted to hear. I'm going back to work. Granny shook her head in despair. Later on, after Herb had left, she took Mama to task. "Louise, I've told you and told you that you must think of male pride. Men have to be— Oh, Mother, I can't fart around with that Southern stuff. It takes too long. I gave it a try like I promised. Now stop fussing." She returned to her old job as a telephone operator. Some of the seniority she had collected before she married was still good, so she advanced quickly. The murderous pace and tension of the work suited her temperament perfectly, and even seemed to relax her. Forbidden to smoke on the job, she got used to fewer cigarettes and managed to cut down to 2 packs a day with no trouble. However, vehemently she might deny it, her decision to go back to work had everything to do with that John Quincy shit-ass stuff. In his quiet, sardonic way, Herb had saved me from the destructive aspects of Granny's lady smithery, and now he had saved Mama from herself. Granny was right about one thing. His Henry Adams theory did put ideas in my head. The approach of puberty was beginning to add another dimension to my peer problems, making me wonder what kind of a woman I would be and what my adult life would be like. At 10, my powers of speculation were still extremely limited. But I had a feeling that I was destined for the kind of tumultuous situation that Mama called a beaut. Seeking some sort of answer, I read The Dynamo and the Virgin, and turned Henry Adams into a household oracle. Ignoring Granny's laments, "If I hear that name one more time," I pursued the subject of America's goddess shortage with Herb. "Take, for example, the Southern woman's obsession with maiden names," he said. "Have you ever heard anyone refer to Evelyn Bosworth?" "No, it's always Evelyn Cunningham." He nodded. "What other examples can you think of?" "When we go to see Aunt Nana, all the old ladies call me Louise Redding's girl. Some of them call Mama Laura Upton's girl." "Quite right. You probably don't remember this, but there used to be a very old lady of 95 or so who remembered Mrs. Redding's mother. I actually heard your grandmother referred to as Mary Codrick's girl." "Aunt Nana does it even with her own name," I said, warming to the subject. "Like when she says, 'Never let it be said that Nana Cunningham deserted a friend in need.'" Herb crossed his legs and smiled an almost cat-like smile of immense intellectual satisfaction. "Genealogy in the service of perpetual virginity," he purred. "The land of the clinging vine is actually the land of the clinging maiden name, isn't it?" I graduated from elementary school that spring. Near the end of the 6th grade, we were given an IQ test, without being told what it was. The teacher, a Huggy Bear, became so unhinged by the mere thought of a sabbat being tossed into her leveling machine that she spent most of the morning praising the forthcoming test in an Aeschylean speech that sounded like Clytemnestra compulsively telling everyone who would listen that she had never, no never, committed adultery. "I have some good news. You're going to take the most wonderful test tomorrow. It's going to be fun. I'll bet you think that's too good to be true, don't you? Well, it is true. How about that? Now, it's a little different from what you're used to. You have to use a special pencil, and you'll be timed. But it has lots of pictures of things like, slices of pie and circles and squares and such. And best of all, I know you'll be happy to hear this. You won't get a grade on it." "Then why are we taking it?" I asked. I got the look all Cassandras get. "To help you get used to grown-up tests," the Huggy Bear replied, forcing a laugh. "You're growing up, and you're going to junior high." After the test, Peg and I compared notes. Considering our long-standing mutual aid pact, wherein I copied her math and she copied my spelling, our reactions were not surprising. "I finished the pies way ahead of time," she said, "but I only got halfway through the part with the story and the list of words." I was the other way around. The story and words were easy, but the pies got on my nerves. "You're supposed to figure out which pieces made a whole circle and which were the extra ones that didn't fit." "I know, that's why they got on my nerves." I bet they're trying to figure out what we're good at. But they already know. A voice behind us spoke. They're trying to find out who's smart and who's dumb so they'll know what track to put us in when we get into junior high. It was Ann Hopkins, the only girl in the 6th grade able to wear a skirt without suspenders to hold it up. She was what Granny called overdeveloped. What's a track? I asked. There's 7A1, 7A2, 7A3, and 7A4. 4 is smartest, 3 is next to smartest, 2 is average, and 1 is dumb. I want to be in 7A2 so I can be popular. Average kids are always the most popular. Her eyes widened. It's even more important for girls to be average. Boys don't like smart girls, but you have to be smart enough to ask the right questions when a boy is explaining something to you. So that's why I want to be average. You get the most dates. On a hot, rainy September morning, Peg, Helen, and I walked to Powell Junior High, just above 14th and Park Road. My new-look, transparent plastic raincoat, the last word in post-war fashion, was so long that water dripped off them directly into the top of my socks. We squished into the building and followed the signs to the auditorium and took seats. At 9, the principal entered, followed by 4 women teachers. He mounted the podium and unfolded some papers. I will call the names of those of you assigned to 7A4. When you hear your name, rise and stand by the wall until the group is complete. Our 3 names were not among the ones he called. When the intellectual plutocrats had left with their new homeroom teacher, the principal began on the 7A3s. We were in it, and so was Ann Hopkins. As we made our way to the wall, Peg and I exchanged a resigned glance. Words, she said. Pies, I replied. Anne groaned at the thought of being next to smartest instead of average. A pretty blonde teacher named Miss Ogilvy beckoned us to follow her. As I squished moistly behind her, I admired the way her new-look skirt swirled glamorously in undulating waves near her ankles. It also stayed up on her hips, while mine was pinned to my undershirt. To complete the contrast, she looked as fresh as a daisy, and I was beginning to smell. It was the plastic raincoat. Some amazing new synthetic chemical, as yet unperfected, was wafting from it like vapor from a cesspool. I sniffed at my forearm and nearly gagged. Whatever it was, it had clung tenaciously to me. In homeroom, Miss Ogilvy arranged us alphabetically, made a seating chart, assigned lockers, gave us our class schedules, and asked for someone to act as class chaplain for the daily Bible reading. I scrunched down and concealed my face in my stinking arms, terrified that she would pick me because I looked like a class chaplain. And Hopkins volunteered for the job, and I breathed again. When the first period bell rang, we remained seated because our first class was English, and Miss Ogilvy was also our English teacher. After issuing us our books, she passed out composition paper and told us to write a theme on one of the topics she listed on the blackboard. They were what I did this summer, what I want to be when I grow up, and my family. I had no idea what I wanted to be when I grew up. And Hopkins did. I glanced over and saw her scrawling wife and mother in her purple ink and circling the dot over the I in her customary way. She and I had already clashed over her ambitions. For all I had heard about ancestors, I had no wish to be one. The idea of having children so they could have children so they could have children frightened me. It seemed so pointless, like that blissful measure of time in heaven that so comforted the devout. If a bird transferred every grain of sand on every beach, grain by grain, and dropped them in the ocean, that is the beginning of eternity. I derived comfort from what I called overness, possibly because Herb's Socratic dialogues always ended in such neat, inescapable conclusions. Thinking of him, I decided to write on my family. Quote, My grandmother lives with us. She is my mother's mother, but new people moving into our building always guess it wrong. They think my father is her son instead of her son-in-law because he's so polite to her. When I didn't catch a mother-in-law joke on the radio, Aunt Charlotte said it was because I never saw the kind of stuff that usually goes on between a man and his mother-in-law. Granny's friends like my father, too. They are all daughters. When they come to see her, he always tells them little things about history that they like. Tessie Satterfield, who brought me into this world, calls my father a prince among men. Jency, the colored woman who works for us, says they broke the mold when they made my father. The librarians at Mount Pleasant all like him, too. All women like my father, but he doesn't have any men friends. I guess that's because he's so nice. End quote. I felt I could have done better if only I had not smelled. My arms had absorbed most of the chemical and reeked at the slightest movement. Trying to contain it had affected my penmanship as well as my thoughts. When the bell rang, I rushed into the girls' room and washed myself wherever the raincoat had touched me, but the smell remained, at least in my imagination. I could not afford a lapse like this. I was used to being a pariah for flattering reasons, but now I was a real pariah, and it made me feel vulnerable. Dimly, I sensed that a female with a personality like mine has to make sure that she looks and smells good at all times. Or, as Henry Adams put it, those who study Greek must take pains with their dress. So far I had kept the watery moles in a state of resentful awe, but if I stank, their mood would change to scorn, and I would be powerless. Nobody cared how a loner boy smelled, but a girl who is a misanthrope must be nice to be near. The raincoat fiasco traumatized me so much that I did something completely out of character. I took Granny's long-ignored advice on ladylike graciousness and tried to be friendly. The object of my sudden warmth was a late enrollee named Harriet Mudd, who stalked into homeroom the next morning and thrust her card at Miss Ogilvy. She had muscular shoulders, thick glasses, and tiny black eyes with an odd bright shine. Her complexion was taupe, and her demeanor grim. "I'm afraid all the lockers have been assigned, Harriet," said Miss Ogilvy, "but I'm sure one of the girls would be happy to share hers with you." She turned to us. "Do I have a volunteer?" Every female hand in the room shot up. All the virginless American dynamos were eager to practice goodness without clout. It felt strange not being the only one with my hand down, but this sort of thing happens to the best of us. Ann Hopkins was waving her arm frantically, and I nearly tore mine out of its socket as I hacked desperately at the air near Miss Ogilvy's face. "All right, Florence, thank you. Please take Harriet out in the hall and show her your combination." I rose triumphantly and gave Harriet a bright smile. Her face remained immobile. I told myself she was just shy. As I worked the combination lock, she seemed to be listening for a click, like safecrackers in the movies. Her eyes, minuscule to begin with, turned into mere pinpoints. She reached into her sack-like purse for a small black notebook, wrote down the combination, then replaced the notebook with a swift, secretive gesture. She uttered not a word the whole time, but I looked on her silence as a challenge to my newly acquired charm. I would soon have those taupe lips curling. She spoke her first sentence to me at 3:15 that afternoon when I tried to put a book on the locker shelf. "You touch his locker again and I'll kill you." I looked around. She couldn't possibly be talking to me. This sort of thing never happened to gracious ladies who made everybody happy. But there was no one else in the hall. I was alone with my new friend. She grabbed my books off the shelf and threw them at me. "My pop was a war hero," she growled. "He drove a tank for Patton. He killed lots of people, and he showed me and my brother how to do it. You smear axle grease on an ice pick and stick it straight into their heart. When you pull it back out, the grease seals the hole so it don't show, and the doctor thinks you died of something natural." She dipped into her haversack and pulled out an evil-looking pointed instrument and a can stamped Western Auto Stores. "That's for you if you don't stay away from this locker." She slammed the door shut and jerked her head toward the stairs, taking no chances that I would sneak back and open it after she was gone. I decided not to argue with her. A girl who called her father Pop was capable of anything. I descended the stairs, my spine crawling at the sound of her ponderous tread behind me. Peg and Helen were waiting for me outside. "Why are you taking all those books home?" "I have a lot of homework." "Already? It's only the second day of school." I almost told them about the death threat, but I hated to publicize my defeats, especially one I had volunteered for. How would it look if I admitted to a falling out with my new locker mate after only 5 hours? Even the chronically unpopular took longer than that to get a feud going, and this was more than a feud. Needing time to think, I brushed off their questions and changed the subject to one guaranteed to absorb us all the way home: pubic hair. I spent the evening with the story on the tip of my tongue. Each time I almost told it, I considered the consequences and stopped. I could not tell Granny, an uncomprehending veteran of my social wars. She would only say, "What did you do to the poor child to upset her so?" I could not tell Herb. He was for good news, like report cards. There was something almost sacrilegious about the idea of going to Herb for help in this sort of crisis. It would have been a travesty, like using a fine linen napkin to wash a car. Herb was a luxury, like Ashley, and the situation clearly called for a necessity. That meant Mama, but I did not see how she could rescue me this time. Harriet was not a teacher or a tombstone, but a girl my age, and Mama could not move in on a kid, even a monster kid. Besides, in a funny way, I was afraid that if she met Harriet, they would take a liking to each other. After all, they were both loaded for bear. I had a fleeting fantasy of the two of them going out on a rampage together and having a grand old time. The knowledge that they were sisters under the skin was painful, like having a brother whom Mama loved better than me. While Harriet was not a boy, she was much closer to being one than I was, so she loomed in my mind as the son Mama had wanted. That night I lay in bed reviewing my options. The most direct solution, guaranteed to please Mama, was to beat Harriet up. There were 2 holes in this approach that no amount of axle grease could close. First, although I was taller, Harriet was much stronger. It would be no exaggeration to describe her figure as burly. Second, how could I, with my long history of peer problems, walk into junior high on the 3rd day of school and start slamming the new girl around for no apparent reason? When the dust settled, I would, of course, reveal my reason. But how would it sound? "She threatened to stick an ice pick in my heart." Who would believe that? Harriet would only deny it. A search of her haversack would bear me out, but that solution was flawed too. Violent people invariably have an animal shrewdness that I knew I lacked. Somewhere between the fray and the principal's office, Harriet, like Lizzie Borden, would find some way to get rid of her incriminating weapon, leaving me holding the ice-pickless and greaseless bag. A quieter solution was to tell Miss Ogilvy in private, but that would bring me up against the same credibility problem. Teachers are old hands at childish hyperbole. "She threatened to stick an ice pick in your heart." "Yes, ma'am." If I had known Miss Ogilvy better, she might, I say might, have believed me. But after only 3 days, no. Not in 1947. Schools were peaceful places in those days. My third option was to call Harriet's bluff, but having looked into those glittering peppercorns that passed for eyes, I didn't dare risk it. She might stab me. I was afraid of her, but more afraid of what she represented. Like all members of the shabby genteel class, I hated low-class people. Being a shabby genteel Southerner only intensified this prejudice, We are bottomless wells of aristocratic disdain and empty thimbles of aristocratic power. All we can do is badmouth poor white trash. For the remaining days of that week, I carried my books everywhere. Nobody paid any attention. I was always carrying books. As long as the weather stayed warm, I could count on not being noticed, but what would happen if I started carrying a coat around, I did not know. By happy chance, I never found out. My problem was solved suddenly and permanently on Saturday morning when Granny opened the newspaper and uttered a cry of despair. "Oh, the poor little soul! Did you know a girl named Harriet Mudd? It says she went to your school." Her past tenses were music to my ears. I jumped up and read over her shoulder. Bronze Star winner and family killed in collision with train. Suicide ruled. Cumberland, Maryland. A speeding B&O freight train took the lives of Albert J. Mudd, his wife, and their 2 children Friday night when the decorated Third Army veteran drove onto the tracks here. Witnesses said Mudd, who had been under psychiatric care at Walter Reed Hospital, shouted, "Here I come, Georgie," and crashed through a lowered signal bar in an apparently deliberate attempt to end his life. The story went on to list the names and schools of Harriet and her brother. It was true. Somebody up there liked me. "Did you know her?" Granny asked sorrowfully. "Just a little," I said, struggling to keep a grievous expression on my face. "Mudd," she said pensively. "That's an old Maryland name. Was she descended from that doctor who was involved in the Lincoln assassination?" She could have been. In homeroom on Monday morning, Ann Hopkins, who had already lectured me on the need to show boys how deep the waters of womanly emotion ran, burst into tears and simulated a fainting spell. That the boys looked distinctly uncomfortable escaped her notice. Miss Ogilvy, no believer in letting students verbalize their finer feelings, insisted on an immediate end to the display, and called for a constructive response. "Flowers," Anne sobbed. "We have to send flowers." "Well, that would be appropriate," said Miss Ogilvy. She looked around in that way teachers have when they are getting ready to appoint a volunteer. My hand was down, but there was a clear logic to her choice. "Florence, since you were Harriet's locker mate, would you take up a collection and stop by the florist's this afternoon?" I went up and down the aisles, gathering nickels and dimes, my smile muscles aching from suppression. When I had all the money together, we voted on what kind of flowers to send. It should have been over then, but Ann Hopkins still had some more womanly feeling to let out. "Miss Ogilvy, I think Florence should lead us in prayer." Miss Ogilvy handed me the Bible, and I read the 23rd Psalm, all the while thinking that the death of the Mudd family was the greatest event in the history of genetics since Mendel crossed his peas. I was in a state of delirious joy the whole day, but I had to hide it. All the girls went round with dolorous faces and spent lunch hour talking in hushed tones about what a wonderful person Harriet had been. None of them chose to remember that they had known her for only 4 days, and that during that time she had not even said hello to them. They competed with each other to deliver the most moving testimonial to her basic sweetness, what she was really like, deep down and inside and in her heart. Each girl knew how warm and friendly Harriet had been, and I, who did know, had to keep quiet. By lunch hour the next day, the legend of Harriet Mudd had sprung up like a Nashville hit. It was the human comedy, female version. Being unable to find the essential goodness in Harriet was an admission that there was no goodness in oneself. So all the girls in our homeroom related tender little stories about her, some thoughtful favor she had done them, something sweet she had said to them, a cute joke she had told. And I, to whom she had spoken as Cato to Carthage, had to keep quiet. "Do you think that's all I had to endure? Read on with me. The best is yet to be." When I got home that afternoon, Granny was wearing her good black hat. "Change into your church dress. We're going to pay a call at the funeral parlor. I've invited Mrs. Bell to go with us." The caskets were closed, of course, so Mrs. Bell did not have a very good time. It was a shame, because she would have been the ideal person to help me realize my fantasy of folding Harriet's taupe fingers around an ice pick. Picturing the scene in my mind, I doubled over, and Granny patted my shaking shoulders, so I had to pretend I was crying. The other mourners were extremely fat women with mean mouths and red-faced men with little pieces of toilet paper stuck on razor nicks. Granny gave them a dubious glance. "These people look right trashy to me, but we must pay our respects." "We're all equal in death," said Mrs. Bell. Granny was so pleased by my show of womanly grief that she added an extra $1 to her share of my allowance that week. Of a far greater value was the lesson I learned from the whole ungodly mess. I never again tried to make myself liked. That ends Chapter 6, and thank you for listening. From the back of the book, the Los Angeles Times says, "Confessions of a Failed Southern Lady is astonishing. So original, so odd, so wonderful, so bizarre, and finally so heart-wrenching. In the midst of some of the most hysterically silly passages in the book, the reader gulps and notices that this true confession really is a true confession. This is a stunning book, a masterpiece." The New York Times Book Review said, "Hilarious. Florence King has now turned her rambunctious talent to autobiography. When the author is born, the Kings are joined by Granny. Anybody could have a family," writes Miss King. "She wanted a race all to herself." Susan Brownmiller said, "Florence King's irreverent confessions are the damnedest adventures to come down the pike in recent years. I started grinning on page 2 and never stopped. She is a Bombeck with a bite, a female Art Buchwald with Southern sass, an A1 original humorist down to her wicked, wicked bones." The Kansas City Star said, "A consistently engaging, funny, savvy, explicit, and often poignant memoir. An unflagging good read." And last, the Chicago Sun-Times. "An outrageous commentator on men, women, and other sources of amusement, particularly the Southern variety. Sharp wit and perceptive observation of the relationships between men and women and women and women. She never loses her warmth or her humor."